What is going on, everybody? I hope you're having a great day today. This is Alex from the Fresh Fantasy Podcast, and this is the second episode of Season 4. Today, we are talking about early undervalued players. These are players we feel are undervalued, using underdog ADP as we feel like it is the most relevant and accurate at this point in the year. All these guys we're talking about are guys we feel like need a little bit more love and affection, and drafters are just not giving them the respect that they probably deserve as fantasy football players. But for an episode like this, we need to bring in a very special guest. So joining me today to break this all down is a man who is one of the faces of a company, in my completely unbiased opinion, that is one of the greatest fantasy football companies in existence. He is the host of an FSGA award-nominated podcast while also being a husband, a dog father, and one of the kings of the Twitter streets. With over 42,000 followers on Twitter, you know him, you love him. He is Footballguys Dave Kluge. Welcome back for Season 4.
Thank you, man. I think this is my third appearance now on Fresh Fantasy Podcast, but always a really good time. My wife woke up extra early this morning knowing that I had some shows to record and decorated my studio up. So birthday celebrations, ready to go. Excited to talk some football with you today, Alex.
Oh, absolutely. I'm so happy to have you on. I think the first time I had you on was all the way back in Season 2. And I actually believe it's your fourth appearance because I had you on twice for Season 3. So here we are back in Season 4, a couple of years later. I'm older. You're older today, with it being your birthday. The people might be hearing this a couple of days later, but as the time we're recording, it is your birthday, celebrating the big day. I'm not going to reveal how old you are to make you feel too old.
And I had you on the launch pad a couple of years ago, and I just launched you right past me. Now you're passing me up, and Twitter followers blowing up in these streets, man. Love to see it.
Hey, Twitter threads are a beautiful thing. That is the only thing I have to say on that. But today we are talking early undervalued players. As always, we're going to go top to bottom. We will start with quarterbacks. We will work our way down to running backs and wide receivers. I have 5 players to talk about today. Dave has 5 players to talk about. We'll do a small discussion on each player. But Dave, you are the guest. You are the birthday man, and you have the floor. Who is your first undervalued player that you want to talk about today?
So, I say it all the time, but when player ADPs change, your takes have to change. And last year, I wanted nothing to do with Russell Wilson because he was getting drafted as a back-end QB1, and I dodged a bullet there because his season was disastrous. But now, with Russell Wilson getting drafted at QB 18, I think that there are some reasons for optimism here, and I actually like him at that ADP. Now, try to build a case with data is admittedly kind of hard with Russ because it looks like he's trending downwards, and seeing a quarterback trending downwards at age 34 raises all sorts of alarms. But looking over his career, he has built a career on being a hyper efficient player. Throughout his career, not counting last year, he had a 6.6% touchdown rate and a 1.8% interception rate. Last year, 3.3% touchdown rate, which is half of what he's done throughout his career, and a 2.3% interception rate. I think that those are just outliers, and he's going to go back towards his career averages this season. This was the first time he has ever played on a team behind the Seahawks, besides the Seahawks. First time he's ever played in a season without Pete Carroll. So there were naturally some growing pains there. I talk about the interception rate and the touchdown rate, but PFF, they agree too. He had the worst offensive grade of his career and the worst passing grade of his career. But there were these little signs of life that we saw at the end of the season after Hackett was shipped out of town. He was the QB2 over the last few weeks, which inspires enough hope that I can get on train and build this narrative that he can bounce back in 2023. 34 isn't young, but it's too old to just completely fall off the age cliff like it looks like Russ is right now. And now the Broncos have brought in Sean Payton, who has a history of highlighting his best players and getting the best out of his offense. Mike McGlinchey and Ben Powers were two of the biggest names in free agency for offensive line. Denver paid $140 million to lock up both of those guys. They've got Samaje Perine, who's going to work as a safety valve out of the backfield, which should help Russ, who doesn't have the same legs he did earlier in his career. And the biggest thing is he's under contract through 2028. It's not like Denver can just say, hey, we made a mistake here, wash their hands and move on. They're eating $85 million in dead cap if they decide to cut him after this year. So he's going to be around for a while. They are going to have to figure out a way to make this work. Biggest thing I want to say, though, with Russ Wilson is prior to last year, he had 8 consecutive seasons as a top 10 fantasy quarterback. 4 of those, half of those 8, were in the top 3 finishes for quarterbacks. So this guy has an elite ceiling, immense upside, and you can draft him right now as a middling QB2 in the later rounds of your draft. So even if he doesn't bounce back, his ADP isn't going to hurt you all that bad.
It's crazy, and it's weird how maybe like one of the one early market advantages for fantasy football this year seems to be player narrative outside of fantasy football. Like I was talking with Josh Larkin, episode 1 of the podcast for this season about Deshaun Watson. No one loves him as the person, but as a fantasy football player, he's been nothing but productive. Same thing with Russell Wilson. People act like he is like the worst human being of all time. He's just like an egomaniac psychopath, but in fantasy football, he's a pretty good quarterback. And to stick with that theme of maybe we don't like the person, but we should be liking the fantasy football player, my first undervalued player is Aaron Rodgers. So, I mean, outside of the 2 years in his career that he's been hurt, he has finished as a top 9 fantasy quarterback in 11 of 12 years. He was 7th or better in 10 out of those 12 years, and he has 7 top 2 finishes over those 12 seasons. And that one finish outside the top 9 was last year when he was the QB 13, throwing to Allen Lazard, Christian Watson for some portions of the season, and a Packers cast that was not anywhere near the level of talent that Aaron Rodgers is used to playing with, and he still finished as a QB 13. And right now, in underdog drafts, he's going as the QB 15. He's going lower than he has ever finished in his entire career, and all signs point to him being on the Jets, where he's going to have Garrett Wilson. Odell Beckham Jr. seems like he wants to join the Jets at this point as we're recording this. McCole Hardman is there. His boy Allen Lazard is there. I mean, Breece Hall is going to be back to give them a running game element that he has had with the Packers. But I think ultimately this situation can only be better than what he had in Green Bay so far. And ultimately, Aaron Rodgers is being drafted below his worst finish ever in his career when he's played a full season. This once again goes back into the narrative of, yes, these are older quarterbacks. Yes, they are people that is probably not the guy you want to go get a beer with or have lunch with. But as fantasy football quarterbacks, they're productive year in and year out. I think that is enough on the quarterbacks. Let's move on to a couple running backs that we really like. Dave, we'll start with you. Who is the first undervalued running back that you think that people need to be given a little bit more love to?
Man, anyone that watched me last season on your show or followed me on Twitter last offseason is probably like, what are you doing? Because these were like my biggest fades last year. I wanted nothing to do with Russell Wilson.
Same.
And I wanted to do nothing with Cam Akers. But Cam Akers, his ADP is at a point right now where I think that he is absolutely worth drafting. I mean, we got to remember last year, he was playing fresh off an Achilles injury. An Achilles injury used to be a death knell for running backs. Deonta Foreman was the first guy that ever really performed after an Achilles injury. And now all of a sudden we see James Robinson not maybe playing his best football, but back on the field. And we see Cam Akers all of a sudden looking kind of efficient at the end of last season. And I think with Cam Akers, what we're looking at is really a tale of 2 seasons here. Through week 12, he played 50% or fewer of snaps in every single game. He did not exceed 50% of the snap share in a single game through week 12. From week 13 onward, he saw 72% or more of snaps in all but one game. So then all of a sudden he got this huge workload from week 13 through the end of the season. And from week 13 through the end of the season, he averaged 19.1 touches per game. He averaged 17.7 PPR points per game. This is the workhorse role that Cam Akers was supposed to have when he was drafted in the second round. Is it crazy to think that maybe he was just limited early in the year? I mean, it was still only a year removed from the Achilles injury that he had. I think that they were just limiting him. And then once they saw that he was fully back up to speed, they let the leash out a little bit. We saw a similar boom in usage at the end of his rookie season where he went on a tear at the end of 2020. People forget, but he had a huge hype train going that just kind of got derailed when he tore his Achilles injury in July. But like I said, he's a second-round pick. He was built and drafted to be a workhorse running back for the Rams, and he's still just 23 years old. I mean, he was drafted so young that he is still very young and has a ton of room to grow. He's going to be 2 full years removed from the surgery before this season kicks off. Sean McVay loves him. We've seen spurts of RB1 output, and right now going as RB25, you can draft him as your RB3 or RB4.
Yeah, it's absolutely insane with Cam Akers and how low he is going right now relative to what he looked like, especially we all understand that this podcast is being recorded far before the NFL draft. They could draft someone and all of a sudden, he goes down lower down the board and he's still a value to be getting. But as of right now, there's no other competition. It's not like he has Darrell Henderson behind him where people are fearing that, Darrell Henderson is going to turn into this, second coming of Marshall Faulk every single week, which never happened. But ultimately, he doesn't have that same competition at this point. And right now, he is a value. Another guy that also is losing some competition behind him, but still not getting enough love is Joe Mixon. I love Cam Akers, Dave, don't get me wrong. I think he's a great value. But Joe Mixon is going just 2 spots above him right now. I mean, the same Joe Mixon that over his last 5 seasons has finished as the running back 10, 13, 4, 10, and running back 49 in a season where he only played 6 games. So every year he's played more than 6 games over the last 5 years. He's finished at least as the running back 13, if not higher. And now the pass catching specialist that was behind him in Samaje Perine is gone to Denver. And he averaged 9 touches a game. And the only running backs currently on the Bengals roster are Chris Evans and Travion Williams, who have 95 combined career touches. 95 over 6 seasons. So as a combined duo, they're averaging less than 20 touches per season between those two, which is ridiculous. But also, we talked about Samaje Perine being the pass catching back. Well, did you know that Joe Mixon is actually coming off a career high 75 targets and a career high 60 catches? And they've said with the shooting that allegedly had gone on outside Joe Mixon's home, he will not be indicted on any charges. He should be back for next season. So unless anything else happens, he should be a full go without Samaje Perine, with 2 guys that have combined for less than 100 combined career touches. Dave, can I please ask you, like, what am I missing on Joe Mixon?
I think the concern is that Joe Mixon gets cut because, he still has
Yeah,
a big contract tied to him, and he was less than efficient last year. If you look at his rushing yards over expectation
yeah,
per attempt, he was pretty awful in that respect. And I think a lot of his fantasy value was really inflated by that big 5 touchdown game that he had. So I think
sure.
the fear is that he gets cut, but I'm with you. If he stays in Cincinnati, if he makes it past June 1st and is still on the roster, he's going to shoot up the boards. And then you're getting a guy who should be getting drafted in the second round, who you can draft right now in round 8 or 9.
Yeah, and that's my problem is because I agree that I was expecting Joe Mixon to get cut, but then they let Samaje Perine sign somewhere else. Like if you really want Joe Mixon gone, why not sign Samaje Perine for less than $5 million a year like Denver did, and then just go draft like a running back somewhere early in the draft?
Oh, I'll
To
tell
me,
you
it's a
exactly why. Because they're hoping Jahmyr Gibbs slides to him at 28 or 29 where they're drafting.
well, that would make Joe Mixon's value a little bit not as good, but at least right now, again, Samaje Perine is gone. I'm all in on Joe Mixon's value at this point. But let's move on to another running back that we both like. If I do recall, you have truthered your next running back as much as pretty much anybody else in the industry. And this is one of those rare ones where a lot of times on podcasts, you know this as well as I do, we agree on players. We say that fantasy analysts generally can see, okay, we see the data points, we see why this player is going to be good. But I don't think there was many people that have truthered this player more than you have and been against the grain more than you have. So I'm giving the host and putting the curtain out, but it's your time to unveil and tell us who it is. Who is this player that you're so excited about once again for this year?
It's Damien Harris. And 2 years ago, Damien Harris made me a boatload of money. And last year, he burned me a little bit. And it stunk because his ADP had gotten to a much higher spot than it was the year prior. But right now, you can draft Damien Harris as the RB47. I mean, this guy is almost going undrafted in underdog drafts. I mean, people just don't want anything to do with him. And let me just kind of explain for people that are newer to fantasy football. He led the league in touchdowns just 2 years ago. And in that 2021 breakout season, he was graded as PFF's best running back in the year. He had 14 rushes of 15 plus yards, which was the 5th most in the league. He was an RB3 or better in 80% of his games. He was a top 6 RB or better in 20% of his games that season. He had an elite floor and ceiling combo. You could put him in your lineup every single week and he wasn't going to burn you. And then he would occasionally give you a top 6 outing as well. The story of his career, unfortunately, has been injuries. He missed 14 games in 2019 when he was a rookie. He missed 6 the following year. Even in 2021, when he had 15 touchdowns and finishes an RB1, he missed 2 games that year. And then last year, he missed 6 games and was limited in 4 others. So it's been really, really tough to count on him because it seems like he just has this hamstring injury that has followed him around since college. But if he's healthy, he's going to smash his ADP. I don't know if you've seen the news, Alex. I'm sure you have, but maybe some people listening haven't. Damien Harris is on the Buffalo Bills now, and he steps into a role that was vacated by Devin Singletary that produced back-to-back top 24 fantasy football seasons. Singletary is not a power back. He is 5'7". He is slow. He doesn't have burst. He doesn't have power, but he was pigeonholed into this power role because they needed somebody to facilitate that in Buffalo. Damien Harris is heavier, taller, stronger, faster, more explosive. He is tailor-made for this type of role. Now, he's not going to see any work in the passing game. You can expect that all to go to James Cook, but he can easily see double-digit touchdowns in this role. Last year, Josh Allen and Devin Singletary combined for 19 touches inside the 5-yard line, and you could expect the majority of those go to Damian Harris this year. Now, the team brought in Damian Harris, what I believe, to protect Josh Allen, who they have $250 million tied up in. They don't want him taking those bruising touches at the goal line. So now Damian Harris gets to go on a much more explosive offense where he's going to see plenty of red zone work behind a good offensive line. I think that you can just pencil Damian Harris in for double-digit touchdowns this season.
It's actually pretty ridiculous, especially considering when looking at ADP right now, he's going 5 spots behind Deontay Foreman, who probably won't even be the starting running back in Chicago. He's going behind Kareem Hunt, who's not on a team. He's going behind Alex Madison, who's playing behind Dalvin Cook, AJ Dillon, who's playing behind Aaron Jones. And he's going behind them, and he could be the starting running back on, to me, you know what, who might be a good comparison, maybe not in play style, but in terms of offense, role, and the touches that he's going to see. I think that Miles Sanders last year is a pretty good comparison, where they have the satellite back that everyone's like, oh, Kenneth Gainwell, he can catch the passes, like he's going to be really good. He was so efficient. That could be James Cook. And then Damian Harris is the unsexy running back on a really good team that's going to score a lot of points. But speaking of really good running back that's playing on a team and is in a unsexy role but is going to score a lot of points, how about Rashad Penny? Probably one of the biggest analytics darlings when on the field in fantasy football. And I know when people hear Rashad Penny, they're cringing, they're coughing, they're probably spilling their coffee all over themselves right now. But Rashad Penny, over the last 2 years, leads the NFL in yards per carry at 6.2. Nick Chubb is second at 5.3, and Tony Pollard is third. The only player in the NFL over the last 2 years with over 4 yards after contact per attempt is Rashad Penny. Once again, Nick Chubb is second, Tony Pollard is third. And since 2018, when Rashad Penny was drafted, he is third in yards after contact per attempt behind only Derrick Henry and Nick Chubb. He also leads the NFL in rushing yards over expected from 2019 to 2022. And Rashad Penny is averaging 95 rush yards per game over his last 11 games with 12 touchdowns. All those metrics I just said, the only other running backs at the top are elite. It's not like a metric where he just happens to be first and there's some other crappy running backs that are right behind him. In all these metrics, he's just right next to Nick Chubb and all of them. And then Tony Pollard or Derrick Henry is right after. He's just pretty good company to be in for a running back. It's the same Miles Sanders role where we are not seeing any progression from a Kenneth Gainwell or a Boston Scott. Rashad Penny has a chance to be the number one running back behind one of the best offensive lines and one of the best offenses in football. If you think that he is anywhere near as talented as Miles Sanders, Rashad Penny could go nuclear this season. Am I getting a little bit too hyped? Should we just be, faded by the injuries? What are your thoughts on Rashad Penny, Dave?
I think the arguments for Rashad Penny and Damian Harris are nearly identical. They're two very, very talented players who have been plagued by injuries throughout their entire careers. Now they get new starts with new teams that just so happen to be very explosive teams. It's kind of best case scenario for both of these guys. If you could guarantee that Damian Harris was going to be 100% healthy for the entire season, you could guarantee that Rashad Penny was going to be healthy for the entire season, these guys are probably getting drafted in the second and third round. The big fear right now is the injury history, and that's baked into their ADP. So with the the injury risk baked into there, absolutely worth the cost.
Yeah, if they had a DraftKings bet right now for either Rashad Penny or Damian Harris to lead the NFL in touchdowns at plus 2,000, I'm firing that, putting my entire bank account on it all day. Maybe not actually, I am being sarcastic. But if that bet was out there, you best believe I'd be throwing a couple dollars on either Rashad Penny or Damian Harris to lead the NFL in touchdowns. But we will continue on to the wide receiver portion. We each got 2 wide receivers we want to talk about. Once again, Dave, we will start with you. Who's a wide receiver that you are extremely excited about for 2023 that you feel like is not getting enough love?
I feel like this one's cheating. I had to double check this ADP multiple times and be like, is that right? Does that say wide receiver 31 next to Jameson Williams' name? Because that's crazy. I mean, I think he should be getting drafted way higher than that. He was the wide receiver 1 of his draft class before he tore his ACL. And now he's a year and a half removed from that ACL tear. And we saw him play at a very high level last year, granted in a very small sample size, but the speed that we worried would be lost after the ACL tear was clearly still there last season. The Lions had no intention of rolling him out at full speed, and that's why he was pretty limited through the entire year. But he had three, I guess you can call them touches in his rookie season. One was a 41-yard touchdown reception, one was a 40-yard end around, and then he had a 66-yard touchdown run that was called back on a penalty. He also had another play where he blew the top off the defense, was wide open in the end zone, and an underthrown ball by Jared Goff ended up getting the play broken up. But I mean, this guy is a spark plug. You watch what he did in college, and it immediately translated into the NFL. And that's always the fear with these really fast guys is speed alone enough to translate to the NFL. And it was with Jameson Williams. He can win anywhere on the field, and he's got game-breaking speed. He didn't run at the combine, but he ran a 4.4 flat when he was in high school. There were people that expected him to run in the 4.2s if he hit the NFL combine. Obviously, that ACL tear kept us from really getting it, but he is one of the fastest guys on the field, torching guys in the SEC, torching guys in the NFL. The Lions traded up to 12th overall to get him, despite already having a very talented player in Amon-Ra St. Brown. This was one of the most volume-dependent offenses in the NFL last year. I mean, they pass the ball a ton. They run a ton of plays. I think that both of these guys, Amon-Ra St. Brown and Jameson Williams, could both realistically finish as fantasy wide receiver ones this year for very different reasons. Amon-Ra St. Brown is going to be that guy working underneath and getting a ton of targets. And then Jameson Williams is the guy who can score 15 points anytime he touches the ball. Jameson Williams should not be getting drafted as a wide receiver 3 right now.
I love that. And do you think the ceiling is a wide receiver 1 finish? Do you think, and that also, is that going to hold you back in drafts? Like if you take Amon-Ra St. Brown earlier, are you also going to be taking, Jameson Williams, especially after last year? We saw 3 sets of teammates all finish in the top 12 with the Dolphins and Tyreek Hill and Waddle, the Higgins and Chase. Actually, Higgins did not finish top 12, but Devontae Smith and A.J. Brown, all those guys were, I think, top 13 or 14 in points per game last year. So are you willing to, keep both of those guys in your team and hope that they're like the cheaper version of some of these super teams?
Yep. And then you just draft Jared Goff, 8 rounds later, and you've got yourself what looks like it's going to be a really, really nice stack in 2023.
Well, I'm probably going to stick with the second-year wide receivers this year. I mean, they were a cheat code last year, and I think they're going to be a cheat code once again this year. And we talked last year, probably on my show, we talked about, guys like Jalen Waddle and Amon-Ra St. Brown and how every single year the second-year wide receivers are undervalued, and every year they are awesome when you have them on your team. And my second-year wide receiver this year is Chris Olave. And in his rookie year as a rookie, if I cannot say rookie enough times in one sentence, he led the NFL in receiving yards per route versus man coverage. Led the NFL as a rookie. He was also 8th among all wide receivers in air yards. And his new QB, Derek Carr, finished 2nd in air yards per attempt last year. And ultimately, if you're not convinced by even that, Chris Olave had above average success on 9 of the 10 chartable wide receiver route types. Once again, as a regular, you cannot overstate how good he was at every part of the field. Like I said, he was number 1 in receiving yards per route versus man coverage, top 10 in air yards. He is above average on every single NFL route but one, and he's going into his second year with a QB upgrade. I know that there are people out there that are talking about Andy Dalton's PFF grades for a small stretch of the season, but Andy Dalton wasn't the quarterback for the entire season last year. And now he gets someone with Derek Carr who has had a top 3 wide receiver or tight end in each of the last few years. I'm all in on Chris Olave. I know he's going as wide receiver 14 right now in Underdog, but I still think that he is undervalued and is on pace for a top 10 finish this year, especially with the volume that he could be seeing with or without Michael Thomas, who has not really been on the field that much over the last 3 years. Cannot stop with Chris Olave. Am I getting too excited about him?
No, I love it. I think that his ADP is pretty fair where it's at, just because there are some, concerns about how Derek Carr is going to look on a new team. But the sky is the limit for Chris Olave. And like you said, these year 2 wide receivers have proved to be such a good investment. It was like 7 or 8 years ago, John Paulson at 444 wrote the article about year 3 wide receiver breakouts. And that was all the rage. You want to draft these year 3 guys. But now with how the college and pro games are starting to look a little bit more similar schematically, now we're seeing these guys break out as rookies, and we're seeing that year 2 actually is the really, really big leap. So same reason I'm touting Jameson Williams is why you're going after Chris Olave. And if you're listening, lump Drake London in there as well is another good target. These year 2 guys, it was a very talented class last year, and a lot of them have a chance to step up.
100%. Is there anyone else, ADP wise, any other wide receivers that you think are going to step up, regardless of if they're a second year wide receiver or not?
Yeah, are we talking about my next guy here?
I think we might be talking about your next guy here.
And man, this also feels like a cheat code because I have been touting this guy. If I'm a Damian Harris truther, I don't know what I am for Tyler Lockett, but I've been beating the drum for this guy even harder than Damian Harris over the years. And I just cannot wrap my mind around it that people still need to be reminded how good this guy is. In 2018, that was his breakout season, and he was the wide receiver 16. In 2019, wide receiver 13. In 2020, he was the wide receiver 8. In 2021, he was the wide receiver 16. In 2022, he was the wide receiver 13. If you're able to keep track with all of that, over the last 5 years, Tyler Lockett has not finished worse than wide receiver 16. Top 16 or better in the last 5 years, and he's getting drafted as wide receiver 32. Almost exactly where he was getting drafted last year and almost exactly where he was getting drafted the year before that. And there are just so many narratives about Tyler Lockett that I am just going to squash right now. People say he's injury prone. Yeah, he's always on the injury report, but he's missed 2 games in the last 5 years. He doesn't
Wow.
miss games. Like, this dude is rock solid. People say that he's just a deep threat. Well, over the last 2 years, he has seen his ADP or his ADOT drop dramatically. He used to be a burner when Doug Baldwin was on the team, but ever since Doug Baldwin retired, Tyler Lockett has played in this very versatile role where he plays out of the slot a lot. He runs some underneath routes, and he is much more than just a deep threat. He's a possession receiver now. People say he's too small. I'm not going to even address that because we have 5 straight years of him putting up elite production here. People say that he's boomer bust. Sure, he's been boomer bust in years past. I will concede that. But last year with Geno Smith, we saw him in a completely different role. He was a wide receiver 3 or better, which you consider to be startable, in 75% of his games. He was
Wow.
top 24 or better in over 50% of his games, and he was top 10 or better in 20% of his games. So he's giving you a high floor and a high ceiling every single week. People say that he was a product of Russell Wilson. Well, guess what? He just had his best and most consistent season with Geno Smith. People say that he's too old. The way that he plays, he doesn't take hits. He's going to have plenty of years ahead of him. People say that DK Metcalf is the alpha in Seattle. I don't care. Like I said, he's been wide receiver 16 or better every single year since DK Metcalf has been there. People are going to continue finding reasons to fade Tyler Lockett, and he is going to continue producing. The fact that you can draft a guy who has finished top 16 or better in 5 consecutive years as wide receiver 32, I just can't wrap my mind around it. I don't get it, but this is the 3rd straight season where Tyler Lockett is a smash in all formats.
Well, Tyler Lockett pretty much universally is known as a good guy, but I think this also fits to the early theme that we talked about in the show, where like there's just a narrative around these players, so they end up dropping in drafts just because of the narrative of all the things that you talked about. Excellent point. I kept thinking of different narratives to bring up to add on to your point, but you killed every single Tyler Lockett narrative there is. I admittedly, as someone that was not hyping up Tyler Lockett in this podcast last year, I was saying he's old, he's got a quarterback change. DK Metcalf's there, but he quelled all concerns. And people always love to hate Lockett. Every year it happens, and every single year he seems to outproduce his ADP. I mean, it was like Robert Woods syndrome when he was still, on the Rams, where every single year is undervalued. It was Tyler Boyd, before Jamar Chase was there, where every single year he was always going to outproduce his ADP. But there's one last guy that we have to talk about today before I ask you about your flag plant that I think is going to outproduce his ADP, and that's Jerry Jeudy. And Jerry Jeudy right now is going as the wide receiver 22. And last year, Russell Wilson struggled a lot. Nathaniel Hackett brought down this Broncos team a lot. And Jerry Jeudy, despite all of these things and having multiple games he came out of with injuries, still finished as the wide receiver 22. So he's being drafted where he finished last year with a Sean Payton-led offense. I don't think Russell Wilson could get any worse. And last year, Jerry Jeudy played 11 games with 60+% of the snaps. He had at least 50 receiving yards in 10 of those 11 games. You bring in Sean Payton. And the fact that we talked about Cam Akers' age, Jerry Jeudy is just going to be 24 years old this year. And we are drafting him where he finished when everything that possibly could have gone wrong last year went wrong. And he still produced when he was on the field seeing a lot of snaps. So what's going to change? Courtland Sutton was getting all the hype last year. I was one of the people believing in Courtland Sutton, and he didn't do much. So why is he all of a sudden going to change that? I get Tim Patrick will be back, but it's still Tim Patrick. Like, I love the guy. He's going to be a value, but like, he's not going to take away significant target share from Jerry Jeudy. So ultimately, when it all comes down to it, like, there's no way for me that Jerry Jeudy doesn't go up when he finished where he's being drafted right now after everything he went through last year. Please call me crazy, Dave. Please give me, like, similar with Joe Mixon, if there's any other concerns do you have? Is there anything else with Jerry Jeudy that you're concerned about? Or do
I
you think
think
we might be on to something with the
I think
narrative?
one of the reasons right now that people are concerned is because he's been on the trade block, but is that a bad thing? Like, if he gets traded, is that
Yeah.
really that bad of a thing? I mean, we're hoping that he can kind of fight against the odds from what we saw last year in Denver, but there's also the possible situation that he gets traded to a better offense and gets to be a
Yep.
wide receiver one somewhere. So I'm with you. Jeudy was a guy that I wasn't really too crazy about last year. I think you and I both kind of preferred Cortland Sutton to Jerry Jeudy, but you got to change takes as new information becomes available to us. And Jerry Jeudy looked like the much better receiver last year.
And I think ultimately, like with Jerry Jeudy, like you talked about, with him getting traded and like the talent level that this guy clearly had and everything that like he went through last year, there's not really many teams that like he could go to that I think he'd be in a worse situation. Like, not like I'm saying that Denver like is a bad situation, but like whether he ends up as a wide receiver two, on another team, it's going to be in a high scoring offense. If he's like a wide receiver three somewhere, like the only teams that he could probably go to that I'd be very scared for him would be somewhere like Carolina or Atlanta. So unless he gets traded to like one of those teams, I think it is wheels up for Jerry Jeudy almost no matter where he goes. I'm excited about him this year. And I'm also excited to ask you the biggest question of them all as we are about to close out the show. Your 2023 flag plant, the one player that you believe in more than anyone else. And it might not be this year, it could be next year. What is your biggest hot take for this coming season?
So it's not. I may have misunderstood the question a little bit, Alex, because it's not necessarily for this question or for 2023 for this season. This is more a flag plant for the dynasty people out there. But my flag plant
Okay.
is that Kyle Pitts is going to have a 1,500-yard receiving season at some
Oh,
point in his career. Might not be this year, but you got to bet on the talent here. And his rate metrics are ludicrous. Looking at last year, 34.1% air yard share was the best among all tight ends. 13.1 yards per target, best among all tight ends. 26.6% target share was the second highest among tight ends. 29.4% targets per route run was third. He was 2.07 yards per route run was fifth against among all tight ends. I mean, he is just putting up elite metrics. The problem is Atlanta has a tiny, tiny, tiny little pie. So he's getting a huge slice of a small pie. That doesn't really help us all that much. But in Dynasty, especially, you want to bet on the talent because situations change, talent does not. What could happen? Tomorrow, we might find out that the Atlanta Falcons are bringing in Lamar Jackson. We might find out that they're trading up in the draft and they're taking Bryce Young. Right now, things look bleak for the Falcons, but Kyle Pitts had every single reason to be drafted as high as he did. He was just an elite combo of size and speed and college production. Then he comes out as a rookie, goes for 1,000 yards, and clears any concerns that people had about his talent translating to the pro level. And the problem right now has been situation, but he is still one of the best tight ends in the NFL. I don't know if it'll happen this year. I don't know if it'll happen in 2024, but at some point in his career, he is going to go off. The last thing I will say about Kyle Pitts is that he is still 22 years old. He's younger than Traylon Burks, Garrett Wilson, Daniel Bellinger, Greg Dulcich, Trey McBride. And yeah, there was only 1 year difference in their draft class. So how about this? He's younger than Zay Flowers, Cedric Tillman, and Luke Musgrave, who are all going to be getting drafted in a month here. And if that's not crazy enough for you, he's younger than Spencer Rattler, who isn't even declaring for the draft until 2024. This kid is so young and has so much room to grow that I am saying my flag plant is if you're in a dynasty league, do whatever you can to acquire Kyle Pitts before he explodes.
you might be a tight end, but he's also Hendon Hooker and Stetson Bennett, who are quarterbacks, are both 3 years older than Kyle Pitts. Kyle Pitts is going into his third NFL season, and he's still 3 years younger than two players that are going to be drafted. There was a guy on the Drake college basketball team that was 26 years old. Kyle Pitts, 4 years younger in his third season in the NFL. Also, could be worth mentioning that Kyle Pitts is the highest drafted tight end of all time and also put up the second most receiving yards of all time as a rookie tight end, and then had all those insane numbers that you just brought up. So again, the wheels can only go up. I have two questions for you real quick on Kyle Pitts that I want to hear. A dynasty question and a redraft question that people need to know. Number one, What tight ends, if any, are you taking over Kyle Pitts in redraft this year? And number two,
Oh,
if
so
you were in a middling dynasty team where you're not necessarily contending, but you're not rebuilding, would you trade Travis Kelce for Kyle Pitts straight up?
I would trade Kelsey for Pitts if unless your
Okay.
team is 100% ready to
Yep.
contend, you're elite at every single position. That's the only situation that I think that you hold on to Travis Kelsey, but I have
Okay.
Pitts well ahead of Kelsey in my dynasty rankings. As for this year, there's only two guys that I want ahead of Kyle Pitts. And right now that's Travis Kelsey and Mark Andrews. And then Kyle Pitts is my tight end 3. And now that is holding on to hope that things could possibly change. We can't predict scenarios this early in the offseason. We still have some more free agency. There's still going to be more trades, and we've got the NFL draft coming up here. So as we get closer to the season, if things don't change, I might slide him down a little bit, but I just don't think that they go into next season with completely drawn a blank right now. Why am I drawing a blank on the Desmond Ritter as their quarterback? I just don't think that's going to happen. I think that they're going to make some sort of move to upgrade their quarterback.
Well, even so, if it's not Desmond Ritter, it's Taylor Heineke. You know what I mean? Like, it's not like they have, Mike White waiting in the wind to throw 50 passes a game. Unfortunately, it's Taylor Heineke. It's an offense that just seems like they want to run the ball into the ground with the most middling running backs of all time, whether it's Cordero Patterson or Tyler Algier. I'm here for the running game, but I am not here for the Kyle Pitts disrespect any day of the week. But I love that. But interesting that you would have Kyle Pitts in redraft over George Kittle and TJ Hawkinson. That is not a take I've heard a lot, but I'm all for the Kyle Pitts hype. Always have, always will. Before we go, Dave, you've been a phenomenal guest. I hope you're having a phenomenal birthday. But where can they find you and your phenomenal work on all your different platforms? Where can the people find you? What can they listen to? The floor is yours.
Yeah, real simple. You can find me on Twitter at Dave Kluge. You'll find just about all of my content there. And these days, I used to be all over the place contributing for different websites. I keep it easy nowadays. You can find all my written and video content at Footballguys. I've been cranking out written content, coming out with a new article every 2 or 3 days so far this offseason. So be sure to sign up there if you're looking for a little bit more in-depth analysis.
And did you mention that you may have a podcast that was FS Fantasy Sports and Gaming Association nominated for the best football podcast, The Launchpad? I made an appearance on there when I had just 1,000 followers on Twitter so long ago. And here we are 2.5 years later together on a show talking some fantasy football. Does not get any better than that. But the only thing better than all of it is you listeners continuing to tune into the Fresh Fantasy Podcast week in and week out. I love all you guys. Appreciate you tuning in and making this show possible. But don't forget to leave a review. You guys already know what to do. And I hope you all continue chasing that upside. Until next time.